Plus One Forward, the podcast powered by the apocalypse, where we talk about tabletop role-playing games using or inspired by the Apocalypse engine. I'm your MC, Rich, and I'm joined by my co-MC, Rach Shelkey. How are you doing, Rach?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you doing, Rich?
I am good. Here we are recording right before the holiday, hoping to get this out before the end of the year. Happy holidays to everybody.
Yeah, happy holidays.
And this is our gift to you. We are going to talk about a very cool topic, powered by the apocalypse games and established settings. Rach, you got some opening thoughts to kick this off?
Yeah, I sure do. So we've spent a lot of time on this podcast talking about genre and how it can work into powered by the apocalypse games. What genres certain games are meant to invoke, how we can play closer to the intended spirit of a genre, and how we can fall back to our understanding of a certain genre to help smooth out bumpy bits at the table. Setting, on the other hand, is something we really haven't focused on a lot. It occupies kind of a quirky space in the PbtA design movement.
It sure does.
Oh yeah, I looked over all the games on my shelf and I went, not a lot of these have really strongly defined settings.
It's true. There just aren't that many that have their own default settings. And I think that's to give that flexibility of mixing a bunch of different tropes. And so every time you sit down to play a particular game, whatever playbooks are chosen may change the mix, and therefore the setting needs to adapt for that. But what do you think about that?
Well, I think you're hitting on a good point. With Powered by the Apocalypse games, we don't really have that conversation of, we have to keep the party balanced. We have to make sure all these roles are meant or the story won't function. There's a lot more flexibility to pick what excites us and what interests us. Now, my introduction to role-playing games runs significantly more traditional, which is pretty shocking. It goes hand in hand with this idea of games having very strongly defined settings. My first role-playing game ever, I think I've talked about Star Wars being an early role-playing game campaign, but I was in a Werewolf the Forsaken campaign just to start things off. And there's a lot of content in Werewolf.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of setting fluff to internalize and break down and try to make sense of. Sometimes it felt like I had this really cool idea and I was swinging for it, but I was kind of missing and not quite fully getting the point of it because I saw these really cool things in the setting and I couldn't figure out how they connected. So I built a character, and I think the first time I went to combat, I'm like, I feel like I have a strong character that's got all these functioning things. And it was just a disaster. The game blew apart. Combat went on for 13 rounds and nothing was happening. And I'm like, I don't understand this. How do I roll to escape? This is bullshit.
Roll to escape. Oh my goodness. You were playing PbtA before PbtA was around.
Oh my God, you're right. So in general, being in this position where you don't fully understand the setting, you don't fully understand how the mechanics talk to the setting, it's not really a great place to be. But what I found fascinating was here was this world that didn't really exist in any piece of media beyond what was in this game. And there was all this content just vividly describing this elaborate, complicated world and space for players to occupy. It's not a concept that we really see strongly in the Powered by the Apocalypse community. We don't have endless setting books for us to spend money on and to read through and really digest.
It's true. I have a similar story. My intro was good old D&D, but my first campaign was this homebrewed kind of mishmash world that the group jokingly called, "What books did Harry read this month?" Harry was our DM.
Oh my God.
Because in this setting, there were soul-sucking Morganti daggers, a nation where metal was incredibly rare, so they'd learn to lacquer and harden wood into swords, an anti-paladin, which came from an early Dragon magazine, who happened to have a familiar that was a gnat, G-N-A-T, Nat from Hell. We had a half-ogre custom class, a Wujin ninja from Oriole Adventures, and the god Crom, but renamed to Cord. I don't know why. Literally, I had no idea what fictional something Harry had read and decided to kind of shoehorn into the campaign at any moment. So your feeling of not quite knowing where your place is in the setting was, yeah, I identify with that pretty strongly.
Oh my God, that sounds completely bonkers, but also sort of amazing.
Yeah, my favorite was the nation, the aforementioned nation, where metal was incredibly rare, and they had these hardened wood, and the nation indentured themselves to one of the player characters who had a fleet of spelljammer ships, and he brought them all kinds of metal so that they could defeat a nearby nation.
As a weird aside, I'm gonna do a deep cut, and all I can think of was the really obscure role-playing game Shard, where one of the premises for the world is there is no metal. Everything is pieces of crystal instead.
Nice. That works right into the title. That's pretty cool. All right, so let's look at setting. How do we feel about setting having less of a spotlight in a Powered by the Apocalypse type of game? What about the games where the setting is more important? How do we balance playing to find out what happens with established facts?
So when talking to my partner Rob about the premise I had for this episode, he brought up a interesting point of conversation. What is the difference between premise in gaming and setting? And that took me aback. I had to sit down and think about, if I were to describe a Powered by the Apocalypse game, what is the setting versus what is the premise? And Rich, you had a lot of experience exploring this, right?
I have recently. In fact, if you check the Gauntlet website on the blog, came up on December 20th. The blog article talks about Star Wars Saturdays, which is a campaign that I've been running for the last year. Each month I choose a different RPG, and I kind of favored Powered by the Apocalypse games because, hey, I do this podcast with you. And so I had to kind of shoehorn some of those Powered by the Apocalypse games into Star Wars. And it was kind of an anthology, so every month it would be new characters, new part of the overall galaxy of Star Wars. And the only this is canon that will not be violated is that the original trilogy was the timeline that we were handling. And so I would speak openly with the group as we created characters. Hey, these movies are true. Wikipedia is a resource for us, but we are creating our own canon. The only thing we can't violate is the movies. And within that, I took the premise of Apocalypse World, right, which is kind of Mad Maxy, and I said, where could we fit that into where the premise isn't violated, where the mechanics don't have to be significantly altered? And I chose Tatooine. And I just chose Tatooine because I like Tatooine. I think it's a really neat setting, and it felt like it was a good map. And then, thank you Wikipedia, I found out that I could use the Psychic Maelstrom because there's this Wikipedia article. I'm not exactly sure where it came from, but that Tatooine back in Old Republic or pre-Old Republic days was this verdant planet that a Sith kind of engine thing had destroyed and devastated, and that's how it became this two-sun desert. And I was like, wow, that's super the Psychic Maelstrom. And bam, everything fit. I kept thinking, hey, if we play Apocalypse World in Tatooine, we may have to shave off some rough edges. I may have to come up with some custom moves. But really, we just played it straight. We just played Apocalypse World and did a little pew-pew, and it was like butter. And the other one is Cartel. I'll talk a little bit more about Cartel because it has its own setting, but Hut Cartel is what I ran, and all I had to do there was rename the playbook so they were a little more Star Warsy because Cartel is Mexican narco fiction, and it was Hut Cartel, so I needed to kind of reframe the setup so that, number one, it could be on level 1313 in Coruscant. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm sorry, but it's a video game that could have been amazing and will never exist.
That was killed in the LucasArts blow-up, wasn't it?
Yeah, sadly it was. But we still have concept art, and also some of that concept art influenced episodes of Star Wars Clone Wars, so go watch those because they're really great. But anyway, I stuck it in 1313 and wanted to have Huts involved somehow because Hut Cartel was such a great thing. It's really the whole reason I stuck Huts in there. And I ended up having to kind of create my new canon within that, which didn't violate anything that I knew of, but I really had to do that to get the setup that I wanted. But it worked pretty well. So premises of PbtA games fit really well in an established setting as long as you have a good working knowledge of what the premise of the game is, what the moves are, what the economy is, what stories it's built to tell. But you may have to make some slight adjustments to the game, shave off those rough edges to fit in that established setting, or say, hey, the setting is not as important as what kind of stories this game will allow you to tell.
That's really cool advice. It has me thinking about what games I can stick into settings I wouldn't naturally think of.
That would be fun. Maybe that'll be a future episode.
Ooh. So let's go back to setting overall not being as big a thing in PbtA. And let's go to the root of all things, Apocalypse World. Right. I think we can find some answers here, or at least give us a good starting point. There's about a 2-paragraph description of the setting up front in Apocalypse World. It's on page 8 of the second edition if you want to grab your copy of Apocalypse World and cross-reference. To boil it down even further, the most important parts of the setting are no one really remembers why the world ended. Older characters may have experienced the end of the world during childhood. The world has fundamentally changed from what it was, and there's this thing called the psychic maelstrom everyone is connected to. Is this your Mad Max-style wasteland where the desert horizon rolls on forever and communities fight over gas and water? Or is it a movie like Waterworld where global warming has drowned human civilization and the player characters are struggling to find land to stand on? Or just to throw out some extreme ideas, is the apocalypse in space? Is it on an alien planet? My point is, Apocalypse World doesn't really care about the specific setting details, as long as that handful of conditions in those 2 paragraphs are met. Snow or desert, doesn't matter. Take away the psychic maelstrom, the game kind of falls apart. So the psychic maelstrom is more important to the setting than the actual locations.
Absolutely. I'm sitting here nodding along because I've seen snowpocalypse, junglepocalypse, volcanopocalypse, acid rainpocalypse, and they all work perfectly well in Apocalypse World, yeah.
Yeah, there's some you might have to make some adjustments to, like the driver. Is the driver still driving a car when it's a Waterworld type apocalypse? Well, maybe not, but there's nothing that doesn't say it can't be a boat.
That's right.
You can see this trend in other Powered by the Apocalypse games as well, the idea that the setting and the location isn't intrinsic to what the game is. Monster Hearts, as long as that town has a high school, it can be in any town. Monster of the Week, the whole premise of Monster of the Week is that the player characters are moving from location to location. So the setting is going to be important for that one session, but there's not a lot of space given to it or even the expectations of what the supernatural looks like. That's very much up for the players and the MC to decide.
That's right. The premise is what's strong, but the setting in both of those are extremely flexible.
Yeah, and I think we should take a little sidebar here and say that we're not saying these games are universal role-playing games. I mean, that they're obviously not a game like GURPS or Savage Worlds where everything is up to interpretation. It's just that these games don't spend a lot of time to what the world is and what the expectations of the world should be in fine detail. But what about Powered by the Apocalypse games that do spend a lot of text on defining setting and defining how the setting interacts with the mechanics and the characters?
Well, the first game that I thought of with the idea of established settings in PbtA games is Masks. Not just Masks, the new generation, a young adult supers RPG, but also the more recent supplements that have come out, specifically the Halcyon City Herald collection. Now, that one is a setting book. It's one of the few setting books that I've seen put out that aren't Dungeon World, and this one's put out by Magpie. The Halcyon City is the default setting for Masks, a New Generation. And then Halcyon City Herald Collection is a supplement book that gives you a lot of really interesting ways to exist within that setting. I've been using it with my Sunday group, the Intercontinental Group of Awesome, and we've been playing in Halcyon City. And the Herald Collection is great because rather than, when I think of setting books, I think of the Forgotten Realms campaign setting, which has like nation, population, notable figures, and their levels, and their alignments, and here's the map, and here's how everything goes on, and here's the political things, and here's some plot hooks. Like, that's what I think of when I think of defined settings. Halcyon City Herald collection is 1 to 3 page articles from the Halcyon City Herald. And that's a flavorful bit of fiction, some names, some places, ideas, but none of it is worked within a timeline of this happened and this happened and this happened. There's no listing of all the notable figures, and unfortunately there's no map, and I'm kind of a map guy, but that's okay. The cool thing is, though, that there are tons of custom moves that are all inspired by those fiction pieces. Like, this is a thing that has happened with the mole men. Here's a custom move for when you deal with mole men. And so it's great to have mechanics that reinforce that fiction. But really the gist of Halcyon City Herald collection and Masks: A New Generation is more inspiration than the perspiration of learning pages and pages of canon that you have to adhere to.
Yeah, there's that flexibility, even though you now have ideas and events defined for you.
Right. What's an example that you thought of, Rach?
I went for mostly historical settings because I found them to be really interesting. The first game I wanted to talk about was Sagas of the Icelanders. Obviously, based on the title, this game is set in Iceland. Specifically, as per the setting section of the book, it's Iceland around 900 AD, roughly 25 years after the first Nordic settlers arrive. The setting is very tightly tied to the premise of the game, because one of the questions that Sagas of the Icelanders asks is, will the player characters uphold traditions and the expectations of their young society, or will they reject them and explore an alternate timeline? I think this particular time period that's established in the book around 900 AD is really important because it predates the founding of the National Assembly, and it predates the arrival of Christianity, which end up dictating a lot of the direction that Icelandic society eventually goes down. And because you have that vacuum without the presence of those two cultural artifacts in place, the player characters are able to say, okay, so this is what our culture says we should be. Are we going to uphold that, or is it all garbage? Are we going to go another way? The game doesn't provide detailed maps or locations. Sorry, Rich. In fact, it suggests that at this point in time, you don't have towns. You don't have cities. You have disconnected homesteads and farms, people who will come together for certain events, but that evolved society isn't there yet. The presentation of this setting is sort of this group of settlers out on this rock in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, I feel is very important for two main factors. The first is it explains and supports why so many of the mechanics are tied to the role of gender in society. The setting section talks about the expectations, particularly for men in Icelandic society at the time, in almost like framing it in a slightly toxic way of the expectations to present as very masculine and very dominant. And that's how the moves eventually go. Of course, you can always tempt fate and buck that trend in the mechanics. But for me personally, when somebody explained to me Sagas of the Icelanders, it wasn't about, here is the society that has these expectations and we're exploring how we rise to the occasion when those expectations are challenged. It was described to me as, here's this Powered by the Apocalypse game where the mechanics you can engage with are defined by your gender, which doesn't really give the game any justice. It doesn't complete the conversation of what the game is actually about. The second reason I think the exploration of setting in this game is very important is it dispels a lot of the baggage that I think we have with how we fictionalize Nordic society. To give an unrelated example, if I said to you, Rich, this is a role-playing game and it's about vampires, I think it's not unfair to say that we have certain expectations about what that means and what the game is going to be about, right?
It's true. Yeah, there are a whole lot of fiction expectations I would come into, even though I've played Vampire the Masquerade and know that there are at least 13 different clans.
When you say to certain gamers, this game is about Nordic settlers. A lot of times they go grasping to those stereotypes about Vikings being these vicious warrior people, and then you put in front of them, oh no, this is a game about like the, surviving in this farm and society and how society evolves, and they go, well, wait, I thought I was going on a raid. Like, what is this game?
Yeah, but Rach, where's my horned helmet and my axe?
It's specifically mentioned in the setting details. The horned helmet, I think, what I read is like, helmets do not have horns, and I thought that was so funny. So, Rich, what's another game you can think of that's got a very strong setting tied to it?
I mentioned it before. It's Mark Diaz Truman's game Cartel. That is a game about Mexican narco fiction. It is so specifically set in a particular time. Now, this is a recently successful Kickstarter, and what I have access to is the Quick Start. I've had a chance to play it a few times, and like I talked about earlier, I've hacked it, with his permission, to Star Wars. The setup for Cartel is, right now, the Quick Start's 31 pages. The majority of that is playbooks, but there is a very strong setting set up there. I love the way in which Mark presents it. He starts off with Tres Cuentos, which is 3 stories about life in the cartel. And then he walks through what a cartel is about, how the police are involved or not involved, what federal authorities are like, and all of those are very strong setting elements that not only command how plays should take place, but are also represented as playbooks. A lot of times when I come into a PbtA game, I see a lot of, okay, this is that genre. These are the tropes of this genre, or these are these fictional characters, and kind of all mixed around. And if you choose move A, D, and E, you have recreated Buffy. And if you choose moves B and F, then you've recreated Hellboy, that kind of thing. But the playbooks in Cartel are, this is that part of the Mexican narco fiction. This playbook, that's their story that you're going to tell. You choose how that story is told, what choices you make. And then the moves are absolutely driving a lot of the grit that you want. This is, of course, part of the genre of Mexican narco fiction, but because he's chosen a specific time period and a specific set of events that have put things in motion, I think it's a great engine for conveying the setting and being able to play within it without having to have 50 pages of backstory to read.
Cartel, when I looked at the playbooks and I looked at the setting, you could definitely see that the game leads with the setting, saying this is the space the story is taking place in. This is the type of story that these players are going to be telling, and these are the different roles. You can look at the spouse and go, oh, I could see how this person is related to the narco and where their story could possibly go. And I think that would be different in another Powered by the Apocalypse game where we're justifying why this playbook, why the driver is hanging out with the Skinner. And there's a lot of time spent with building out those connections with players, which is great. But with Cartel, it's very crystal clear. Oh, I could see how we're related. I don't know where this story is going, but I could figure out our starting point very easily.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, absolutely. All right, Rach, you said you had 2 historical PbtA games as vis-a-vis settings. So what's your second?
Well, I figured for people who are familiar with Powered by the Apocalypse games, obviously the second one is going to be Night Witches. It's, I think, the one most people go to when they think historical Powered by the Apocalypse games. And I think in terms of historical setting, it does something very interesting. So in Night Witches, the setting is World War II, and player characters are playing members of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment of the Soviet Air Forces. The main adventure path of Night Witches reflects the actual duty stations that existed during World War II and the 588th went through. These are places on a map that the MC or players could look up and refer to get a sense of where they are in the actual world. The structure of the game is based around moving from duty station to duty station as the players progress through, which is where I think the whole setting connection is interesting, because it almost feels like, unlike Sagas of the Icelanders, where player characters get to define, well, what actually becomes history? Is our timeline different in this game? Is it like an alternative? Do we reject Christianity and hold on to our pagan gods? In Night Witches, the timeline of actual historical events might as well be the setting. It's not really about the outcomes of World War II on a whole. The game seems to be pretty sure that World War II is going to play out the way it did in history. We know the regiment is going to go through these different duty stations. It's more about the player character and their experiences and how they cope with this meat grinder of a slog that they go through, going through on these raids every single night just to, be nuisance bombers, and the politics that occur back on base during the day. The Nazis are eventually going to fall. The war is going to end, but is your player going to live to see the end of their results? That's really the question the game wants you to explore. Some of the setting details also come up in establishing who your character is and giving consideration to why your character would volunteer to be an aviator during World War II. It goes into the history of women in culture in the Soviet Union and establishes the 588th, or sort of the red-headed stepchildren in a bunch of quirky regiments that were already on the fringe because they were all led by women. And amongst that group, you are the weirdos of the weirdos. I think that says a lot for, this is where your character is starting out. And now that's part of the setting, that's part of the expectations, that's really going to reflect on the type of stories and the type of characters that players bring to the game.
I like that it makes space for the weird choices that some players may come in with a lack of historical knowledge or a lack of setting familiarity, that you can be the weirdos and be a little bit off kilter. I think that's a really smart choice that was made in creation of Night Witches.
Yeah, I saw that when rereading parts of the book for this episode, where it encourages the MC, go through and read this history section. It is not completely comprehensive. It will give you enough tools to get the job done. And then it gives you a stock little explanation that might be 3 paragraphs long to give to players saying, this is what you need to know. If you want to eventually go and read the history section, that's great. You don't need to know anything else before you hit the ground running.
Yeah, that's a thing that Lowell has really kind of pushed in games that he runs and impressed me greatly is he runs those giant setting books, right? He just goes crazy with that kind of stuff. And he creates a 1-page cheat sheet. Here is what you need to know of the world. And this is the only thing that you need to refer to, and we'll play forward from that point. And it's really helpful. So I like that in Night Witches, you've got, 3 paragraphs that you can call your Bible, so that players will all be on the same page.
And I mean, even the section in the back of the book that says, here are the important points, slightly expanded, is maybe 10, 15 pages at most. It's not a lot of content, but it gives you a pretty coherent enough view of the world and recent history to get a firm foundation from.
Hi, listeners. I want to take a minute to tell you about the newest issue of Codex, the Gauntlet's RPG magazine. It's called Codex Dark 2, and it's a sequel to the original Codex Dark. Here is what you'll find inside. Ghost Drums, a story game / LARP about vengeful ghosts that deals with themes of colonialism and regret. A Repast of Glum Moments, a collection of inspirational morsels for Swords Without Master and other dark fantasy fiction. Trophy, a psychological horror game about a group of explorers pushing ever deeper into a forest that doesn't want them there. Orchestra of Oblivion, which features new bloodlines for the excellent gothic horror game Rhapsody of Blood. Our newest miscellany, 3 dozen constellations, 8 beautiful illustrations, and a custom layout by Jake Householder. You can get Codex Dark 2 by pledging $4 on the Gauntlet Patreon by December 31st. And a reminder, back issues of Codex are available on DriveThruRPG. Thanks.
Let's go to part 3 here, dealing with the challenges of established settings.
Originally, I thought we would go into various challenges we could see players struggling with and MCs struggling with. But, I mean, in the interviews or the questions you asked other people, and even in my own mind, I came back to the same one over and over and over again, which is when there's an imbalance of player and MC knowledge where someone knows a lot more about a setting than somebody else at the table. That's the big elephant in the room, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that was the first thing that my buddy Heidi said was, the imbalance of intimate knowledge of setting and then the expectations of the setting can be really problematic. You've got player A who knows the setting like the back of their hand, and so they know how to manipulate it, where to go, options they have available. But then player B maybe skimmed the setting info, doesn't know it. They can be disadvantaged in play, either mechanically or not knowing what options they have in front of them, or narratively not having the same array of colors to paint with as the others. So I've seen that. I remember back in the day when I was running Vampire the Masquerade and we set it in Atlanta, and one person had been to Atlanta many, many times, and they actually the living crap out of me as the storyteller, which is the name of the MC in that system, and man, it sucked.
That sounds like it was super frustrating.
It was. But I learned coping skills from that have paid dividends for many years, Rach. So it's okay. Every challenge is an opportunity.
The moment I think of in terms of like player knowledge being uneven is I was once in this Legend of the Five Rings game, and the GM had hard framed us into the scene and really only presented us one option to complete the task at hand. And it was a noble task. I don't remember the particulars other than the solution presented was we were going to disguise ourselves and that this was the only option. There was no other room for conversation. And I went, sure, it seems kind of Robin Hood-y, let's roll with it. But then this was a huge cultural faux pas and we all got punished. And just the fact that it would have been accessible knowledge to my character, but it wasn't knowledge I had as a player, and that there was no middle ground there really made me angry and bitter.
I could see that because it's just like you said, your character would have known what kind of faux pas that would have been, and it would have been something helpful if the GM had said, hey, just so you know, this is the complication that I'm going to throw your way that your character would be cognizant of is a risk that you're putting out there. And
yeah, to go back to Star Wars, that's, I believe in the West End version specifically, we have dark side points. Dark side points are kind of a currency you earn for committing evil acts. The GM has to call out, you're doing something that's out of the spirit of the game. Do you want to do this bad thing? Before the player character goes through with it. There's that like little checkpoint saying, are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to go kill the younglings? Because I don't think it's going to work out good for you.
And some people may think that's kind of like clippy as a GM. Like, I see that you are trying to do a dark side thing. Are you sure you want to do that? And they may object to it. But to me, that type of GMing, it makes sure that we all understand the stakes that are at play, the complications or the consequences that will happen as a result of you doing a thing in this setting. And it adds tension. Right? You have an actual legitimate choice that you're making rather than making a choice that seems like an option to you that probably wasn't a true option to people that exist within that setting. So I would love to go back in time and have your L5R GM say, by the way, if you do this thing, X happens. Are you still going to do it? Is it that important to you? And you guys having that conversation in or out of character and then moving forward with either that or a different option.
Yeah, and I think this is a good point to sort of go back to that old Powered by the Apocalypse touchstone. The game is a conversation.
Yep.
You're always free to have a conversation out of character to check in and say, is this the way that we want the game to be going? Because if it is the way we want the game to be going, sure. But we should understand there are consequences to the action, particularly if it might not be evident to the player. If it seems like a rather rash or if it seems like a very brash or unusual decision, that might be a good time to check in. Now, it's a bit of a balancing act, particularly as an MC, because you are in the best position to sort of uphold those setting details and share those setting details, but you don't want to be the MC that is going through and saying, no, this is a very strict, very rigid interpretation of what the setting is. If you do this way, you're doing it wrong, so you should do it the other way, rather than giving the player the space to make their own choices and to have their own agency about the direction their character is going to go.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a story to tell about this one.
Want to share?
Yeah, so Michael X, who is a member of the Gauntlet community, he has been working on, for the past couple of years, a game called Sea of Stars. And Sea of Stars is a setting agnostic, powered by the apocalypse game that has some really interesting mechanics around player-to-player conflicts. And within it, it has defined playbooks. So I'm running it for Star Wars. So again, we're in the original trilogy of movies as our touchstones. And one player says, I want to play a Twi'lek. Now, Twi'lek, those are the aliens that you see particularly in Return of the Jedi, Bib Fortuna, who is the major domo for Jabba the Hutt, and then Ula, the dancer, who ends up getting eaten by a Rancor. Those are our touchstones for Twi'lek. And there's, of course, tons of expanded universe content on Twi'leks. They were featured in several of the animated series as major characters, so I have that knowledge of the Twi'leks coming in. Player Walter says, hey, I want to play a Twi'lek. Okay, cool. What playbook interests you? The Princess. There is literally a playbook in Sea of Stars called the Princess Playbook, and it's so Princess Leia. It's just beautiful and awesome. And I have this knee-jerk reaction of like, okay, I know about Ryloth, which is the home planet of the Twi'leks, and they don't really have any. There are species that don't have a royalty. Like, that's just not how their community works. That doesn't exist. And I fight it. I fight it real hard because I'm like, number one, we're playtesting Sea of Stars. This is a playbook in Sea of Stars. Number two, I like Twi'leks. Number three, we don't know that from any of the original movies, so Rich, stick with your own ideas and trying to remain flexible. And I said, okay, you're now playing a Twi'lek princess. And so Walter played this crazy Twi'lek princess that still existed in a world where the Twi'leks were often slaves, and they had this kind of tarnished nobility that was going on. We worked in a princess. The princess had an uncle who was kind of in bed with the Imperials, and here she is doing missions for the Rebel Alliance, or the Alliance to Restore the Republic, and it became so tense, and it was amazing. And if I just said, no, actually, Twi'leks aren't royal, why don't you play a Nabooan or something, then it would not have been, I think it wouldn't have been nearly as amazing, because we just kind of, we forked it a little bit and said, you know what, we're not violating the premise of Star Wars Saturdays to do this. And we got to see the Princess Playbook in action. It was great.
I think that's a great example of both the MC and the player making space to play around with expectations in the setting and exploring new ideas.
And you have to do that. You have to say these aspects of setting will be within our story, but if you and I in this conversation say, let's explore this, maybe this is going to be slightly different, because it's a fan fiction element that we're doing here, right? That's what that setting is there for, is to give you everybody being on the quote unquote same page. And if we start on the same page, but we end up changing direction, that's okay. In fact, that's fun, because we can be surprised. And I play a lot of games to be surprised. For that moment when the players all kind of sit back like, oh wow, I did not see that coming.
This has given me serious feels from my teenagerhood when I used to write fanfic. And
yes.
The joy of fanfic is going and reading other people's fanfic because, I mean, there is canon, but everyone's interpretation is different, and canon is just the starting point.
It is. Well, any closing thoughts on Power of the Apocalypse games and settings?
I'm really interested in seeing
Plus One
what
Forward is a production of the Gauntlet community, Richard Rogers and Rach Shelkey. You can find us at gauntlet-rpg.com or follow us on Twitter at @+1FWD. If you would like to support our show, visit our Patreon site at patreon.com/gauntlet. The games mentioned on this show use the Apocalypse engine, which is a creation of Vincent and McGay Baker. The music for Plus One Forward is from the Savage Aural Hotbed CD, Gomi Daiko. The songs used are Gomi Daiko, Metal Version, and Hammer of Bill. You can find more amazing tunes by Savage Aural Hotbed on their website, www.savageauralhotbed.com.
The second edition of the game has some exciting setting books that are coming out too.
Amazing.
Cool. Well, Rach, thank you so much for bringing this to the table. I've had a great time discussing Power of the Apocalypse games and settings with you.
Yeah, and this was just a fun topic to sit down and reread all those setting sections. And again, no horned helmets. I forgot that line was in there. Amazing.
Awesome. Well, happy holidays, everybody.
Yep. Happy holidays and a happy new year to you all.
Absolutely.